Clara Whitfield had always been taller than the other girls in her town. By the time she turned 16, she already towered over most of the boys, and when she reached her full height of nearly 6 feet, the whispers followed her everywhere. Mothers would shake their heads as she walked by, muttering that no man wants to crane his neck at his own wife. Young men, intimidated by her presence, either avoided her or made cruel jokes about her stature. Even in her church pew, Clara could feel eyes lingering on her, not in admiration, but in quiet disapproval. In the small farming community where Clara grew up, women were expected to be dainty, petite, and soft-spoken, the sort of wives who would look up adoringly at their husbands and not overshadow them in stature. Clara, despite her best efforts, never fit that mold. She was graceful, with fine features and a kind heart, but to many men, her height was an insurmountable flaw. Suitors came calling now and then, but the visits were always short-lived. Some left after a single dinner, others lasted until a dance, but eventually the same pattern repeated. Awkward glances upward, nervous jokes, and then silence. Her mother, a practical woman, tried to soothe her daughter's wounded spirit by saying, "The right man will come along, Clara, one who doesn't mind." But Clara couldn't help noticing the worried way her mother's hands twisted her apron whenever the subject of marriage arose. In a town where every other girl her age was already married or engaged, Clara remained conspicuously alone. At 23, she was considered nearly a spinster. The weight of it pressed on her shoulders heavier with each passing year. Clara loved books, music, and walking beneath the endless prairie sky. She dreamed of adventures beyond her little town, rivers that stretched past the horizon, mountains that scraped the clouds. But as the seasons turned, her dreams felt more like an escape than a future. Every path she looked down seemed to end in solitude. It was during one particularly dismal autumn evening, while she helped her mother sort through laundry, that Clara overheard a group of women whispering outside their window. They were discussing another girl in town who had left to become a mail-order bride out west. Clara's ears pricked up. The women clucked their tongues in disapproval, saying how desperate and dangerous such an arrangement was. But for Clara, the words lit a spark. If no man in her town would look past her height, perhaps somewhere far away, where life was harder and appearances mattered less, there might be someone willing to see her for who she was. That night, Clara sat by the light of a kerosene lamp, staring at the classifieds in a newspaper her father had brought home. Tucked between advertisements for farming tools and rail schedules were small, plain notices. Seeking wife for homestead, must be hard-working and God-fearing. Another read, widower seeks companion to help raise children, must be willing to relocate. Each one seemed like a door leading out of the cage she felt trapped in. Clara folded the paper and pressed it to her chest. The thought frightened her, traveling to strange lands, binding herself to a man she had never met. Yet it also stirred a kind of hope she hadn't felt in years. Perhaps her height, which was considered a burden in her town, would not matter so much to a man who needed a strong partner to face the challenges of the frontier. Maybe, just maybe, it could even be an advantage. The days after Clara first discovered the classifieds were filled with restless thought. She went about her chores as usual, kneading dough beside her mother, hanging laundry to dry in the crisp morning air, mending her father's worn shirts by the fire, but her mind was elsewhere. Each task seemed small compared to the larger question that tugged at her heart. Could she really do it? Could she leave everything she had ever known and bind her fate to a stranger? At first, Clara kept the idea to herself. She knew her parents would worry. To them, the prospect of sending their daughter hundreds, perhaps thousands of miles away to live with a man they had never met would seem reckless, even dangerous. And truthfully, Clara could not deny the risk. Tales circulated in town about women who had vanished after setting out to meet husbands in the West, or others who found themselves trapped in loveless, harsh unions. Yet for every frightening story, there were whispers of women who had carved out new lives on the frontier, finding both love and purpose. Clara's heart leaned toward the latter. She was no delicate flower content to wither in the shadow of gossip and disapproval. She had a quiet strength about her, an ability to endure. If marriage was a gamble, then she would rather wager her future on the unknown than sit waiting for suitors who never came. One evening after supper, Clara lingered at the kitchen table long after her parents had retired to bed. The oil lamp flickered, throwing long shadows against the wooden walls. She unfolded the newspaper again, her eyes tracing the brief but earnest advertisements. One in particular caught her attention. Farmer, age 32, seeks God-fearing wife. Homestead in Nebraska. Must be willing to work hard. Lettered replies welcome. The words were plain, even blunt, yet they stirred something in her. The man wasn't asking for beauty, nor wealth, nor social standing. He wanted a partner, someone to share the burdens of life in a place where survival depended on both grit and faith. The train rattled across the plains, carrying Clara farther from the only home she had ever known. She sat with her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, her small carpet bag tucked at her feet, and her heart beating fast against her ribs. Out the window, she watched the flatlands give way to rolling hills and sparse trees, each mile pulling her closer to the unknown. Clara had memorized every line of the farmer's letters. His name was Thomas Wilkes, and from his words she had imagined him as a solid, kind man with weathered hands and steady eyes. He had written that he needed a partner to help him tame the land, someone who would not shy from hardship. Clara told herself she could be that woman. When the train at last hissed into the Nebraska station, Clara stepped down onto the platform with her heart in her throat. She smoothed her skirt, adjusted her bonnet, and searched the crowd. A tall man in a worn coat raised a hand in greeting. Clara's breath caught. Thomas. At first his expression was warm, but as she approached, it faltered. His eyes swept over her, widening slightly as he took in her height. Clara's stomach tightened. She had seen that look before. "Miss Whitfield?" he asked, though his tone had already cooled. "Yes," she said softly, offering a smile. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Mr. Wilkes." He hesitated before taking her hand. His grip was firm but brief. "The journey was comfortable as a train ride could be," she answered, trying to keep her voice light. They walked together through the small town, but the silence between them grew heavier with each step. Clara spoke of the countryside she had passed, the changing seasons, the beauty of the prairies, yet Thomas's replies were short and distracted. His eyes flickered upward toward her face, and then downward, as though he couldn't reconcile her presence. The weeks turned into months, and months into years, and with each attempt, Clara's hope dimmed a little more. After her first rejection, in Nebraska, she returned home with trembling hands and weary eyes, only to write another letter when she could not bear the emptiness of waiting. It became a rhythm she knew all too well, the cautious exchange of words on paper, the long journey by train or wagon, the nervous anticipation, and finally, the crushing blow when reality fell short of hope. Her second attempt took her to Kansas, where a widower named John Harwood sought a companion to help raise his 2 young daughters. Clara's heart softened when she met the little girls, who clung shyly to her skirts. She imagined herself guiding them through their grief, giving them the motherly care they had lost. But John's gaze kept drifting upward to her face, his frown deepening. At supper, he muttered that his girls shouldn't have to look up at a woman like she's a schoolmistress. The next morning, he packed her bag and handed her the fare home. The third time was in Missouri, with a shopkeeper who had written of his longing for a wife to share the comforts of town life. Clara arrived to find him well-dressed and polite, but his smile faltered the instant he saw her. He shook her hand, but later whispered to the innkeeper, unaware that Clara overheard, "She'll frighten away the customers standing behind the counter." Clara left before dawn, her pride in tatters. By the fifth rejection, Clara's parents began urging her to give up. "It isn't worth the heartache, my dear," her mother said softly, brushing Clara's hair by lamplight. "No good man would send you away for something so trivial as height." But Clara couldn't silence the cruel thought that circled in her mind. If 10 men had done just that, perhaps she was the problem after all. And still, she tried. In Iowa, she met a man who owned acres of farmland. He praised her strong shoulders and capable hands, but when they stood side by side in town, his friends jeered. The laughter stung worse than any rejection. He sent her away that evening, his pride wounded by the mockery of others. In Colorado, a miner looked her up and down with a skeptical eye. "A wife ought to be small enough to protect," he told her bluntly. "You'd make me feel like the one needing shelter." Clara held her head high, but her hands shook as she boarded the next wagon east. Each rejection chipped away at her spirit. By the 8th, she could no longer cry. By the 9th, she stopped writing home about her journeys altogether. The letters, from men blurred together, each promising kindness and partnership, each ending with a polite dismissal once they saw her in person. The 10th rejection was the hardest. He was a school teacher in Dakota Territory, a man who wrote of poetry and faith. Clara hoped he might be different. But after a brief supper, he folded his hands and said, "You are admirable, Miss Whitfield, but you would cast too large a shadow in my home." Those words echoed in her ears all the way back on the long, cold ride east. When Clara stepped off the train and saw her parents waiting, she forced herself to smile, though her lips trembled. She had been away so many times now that neighbors began to whisper whenever she returned. "Poor girl," they said, "sent back again." That night, Clara sat at her window, staring out at the moonlit fields of her childhood. For the first time, she wondered if God had simply forgotten her. 10 times she had gone out searching, and 10 times she had been found unworthy. Not for her heart, her skills, or her kindness, but for the inches that set her apart from other women. By the time Clara returned from her 10th rejection, she felt as though the whole town could read her failure in the slump of her shoulders. The train platform was crowded that day, but the moment she stepped down with her single worn carpet bag, silence seemed to ripple through the onlookers. Heads turned, eyes lingered. She caught snippets of whispered words. "There she is again. Poor girl," turned away once more. She should just stop embarrassing herself. Clara kept her chin lifted, her face composed, but each murmur cut into her like a knife. She walked quickly past the townsfolk, her bag clutched tight in her hand, and did not breathe freely until she had rounded the corner and left their stares behind. Her parents met her at the gate of their modest farmhouse. Her mother's eyes brimmed with sorrow, and her father placed a gentle hand on her shoulder but said nothing. That silence hurt more than words. He was a man of few expressions, yet Clara saw the disappointment he tried to hide. Not disappointment. In her, perhaps, but in the world that had treated his daughter so cruelly. Inside, Clara excused herself, retreating to her small bedroom. She sat heavily on the edge of her bed, staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror propped against the wall. A tall woman with tired eyes and a brave face looked back at her. Her chest ached. What more could I give? What more could I change? For the first time, the hope that had kept her writing letters, packing bags, and boarding trains began to slip away. 10 men, 10, had looked at her and found her wanting. It was not her cooking, her stitching, her faith, or her character that they dismissed. It was the one thing she could never change, her height. a gift from God that had become, in the eyes of men, her greatest flaw. That evening, Clara sat with her parents at the dinner table. The meal passed in silence until her mother finally reached across and clasped her hand. "My dear," she said softly, "you don't have to keep doing this to yourself. Some women live perfectly fine without a husband. You could stay here. Help us with the farm. You are more than enough." Clara swallowed hard, fighting the tears that burned her eyes. She nodded, but the words only deepened the ache inside her. She had never wanted merely to exist. She wanted to love and to be loved, to share her life, to build something alongside a man who cherished her as she was. And yet, that dream seemed to be slipping from her grasp like water through her fingers. The days that followed were heavy and slow. Clara went through the motions of chores, feeding chickens, hauling water, mending linens, but her heart was numb. Letters from new suitors sometimes arrived, men who had seen her notices or heard of her through others. Once, the sight of an unfamiliar name on an envelope would have set her pulse racing. Now she tossed them aside, unopened. What was the point? It would only end the same way. The town's whispers grew louder. Neighbors pitied her, some with genuine kindness, others with cruel amusement. One woman at church said within earshot, "Perhaps God made her so tall to keep her from finding a husband. Maybe he's called her to a different life." Clara smiled politely, but her hands trembled around the hymnal she clutched. That night, alone in her room, she finally let the tears come. She wept until her throat was raw, whispering prayers that felt as though they vanished into the darkness. "Lord," she murmured, "if it is not your will that I marry, give me peace to accept it, because I cannot keep breaking like this." In that moment, Clara nearly surrendered her dream altogether. Nearly. The autumn winds had turned sharp, and Clara had resigned herself to the rhythm of farm life once more. She no longer glanced eagerly at the mailbox. The sight of letters, once a thrill, now felt like a reminder of her failures. Most days, she left the small pile of envelopes for her mother to sort through. It was on an ordinary morning, with frost still clinging to the window panes, that Clara's mother carried in a stack of mail. She set it on the kitchen table with a gentle touch. "This one's for you, Clara," she said softly, placing a single, weather-worn envelope apart from the rest. Clara nearly told her to set it aside. She hadn't the heart for another disappointment. But something about the envelope made her pause. The paper was rough, the ink slightly faded, the handwriting bold and uneven, as though the writer were unused to pen and parchment. She traced the name on the corner. Elias Carter, Timber Camp, No. 7 Montana Territory. She hesitated, then broke the seal. The letter was unlike any she had ever received. There was no flowery introduction, no grand promises. Instead, the words were plain and strong, carrying the weight of a man who spoke only what he meant. "Miss Whitfield," it began. "I heard your name through a circuit preacher who passed our camp. He told me you were seeking a husband. I am not a farmer nor a townsman. I am a lumberjack. My life is hard, and the woods are not forgiving. But a man cannot spend his days with axe and saw alone. A home needs warmth. I need a partner, not a doll to sit by the fire, but a woman who can stand beside me. If you are such a one, write back." The letter was signed simply, Elias Carter. Clara read the words 3 times over, her hands trembling slightly. There was no apology in his tone, no hesitation. He spoke as though he were carving each word out of wood, blunt and honest. He did not ask for beauty. He did not mention stature. He wanted strength, companionship, partnership. For the first time in months, Clara felt her heart stir. She pressed the letter to her chest, a cautious smile tugging at her lips. Still, doubt pricked at her. She had been down this road before. Men often claim to want a partner, only to retreat when faced with her reality. Was this Elias any different? That evening, she sat by lamplight with pen in hand. Her first words came slowly, but soon her reply flowed steady and sure. She told him about her upbringing in a small farming town, about her skills in managing a household, and about her resilience. This time, she chose not to skirt around the matter of her height. "You should know I am taller than most women," she wrote, her pen steady. "It has cost me many chances at marriage, though I cannot change what God made me. If that troubles you—" Better to say so now. She ended the letter with a prayerful hope, sealed it, and carried it to the post the next morning. The waiting was torture. Each day she rose with her chores, but her thoughts lingered on the letter, wondering if it had reached him in the rugged wilderness. Weeks passed before the reply came, carried in the same rough hand. Clara nearly dropped it when she saw her name scrawled across the front. The journey westward was the longest Clara had ever taken. Trains carried her across endless plains, through rolling hills, and into mountains that pierced the sky. Each mile she traveled, her heart swung between hope and fear. This man, Elias Carter, was her last try. If he rejected her as the others had, she would not attempt again. She had told herself as much while packing her carpet bag. Her spirit was simply too worn. When the train stopped at a rough little station in Montana Territory, Clara stepped down onto a platform no bigger than a barn floor. The air was sharp with pine and wood smoke, so different from the open prairies. She had always known. Around her, men in flannel shirts and rough boots hefted axes, carried lumber, and barked orders. The place was alive with the raw sound of work and wilderness. She stood for a moment, clutching her bag, her breath misting in the cold. Would he even be here? Or had she been a fool once more? "Miss Whitfield?" The voice was deep, steady, and near at hand. Clara turned and found herself staring into the eyes of a man who seemed carved from the very trees around them. Elias Carter was tall, broad-shouldered, with hands roughened by years of labor. His dark hair was unruly beneath his hat, and his eyes, a clear gray, studied her not with shock or disappointment, but with a kind of quiet curiosity. "Yes," Clara said, her voice steady though her heart hammered. "I am Clara Whitfield." He nodded once, like a man who had expected her all along. His gaze traveled over her, pausing at her height, but instead of the familiar flicker of discomfort, there was something else. Approval, perhaps. Respect. "You're as you said," Elias remarked simply. "Tall and strong, the woods will like you." Clara blinked, caught off guard. No man had ever spoken of her height as though it were a gift, not a flaw. He took her bag from her hand without ceremony, his grip sure but not presumptuous. "The camp's a mile up the road, wagons waiting." The ride was rough, the wagon bumping along a dirt track lined with towering pines. Clara held her bonnet against the wind, stealing glances at Elias as he guided the horses. He was not a man of idle chatter, that much was clear. But when he did speak, his words were thoughtful. He told her of the work, the long days of cutting timber, the meals eaten by firelight, the men who labored with him. "It's not an easy life," he said, glancing her way. "You'll hear the trees groan in the wind, and some nights the snow will bury us near to the door. But if you've got grit, you'll manage." Clara found herself smiling. "I've managed worse than whispers and gossip, Mr. Carter. Hardship doesn't frighten me." That made the corner of his mouth twitch, something like the beginning of a smile. "Then we'll get along just fine." When they reached his cabin, Clara drew a breath. It was small but sturdy, nestled among the pines with smoke curling from its chimney. The scent of fresh-cut wood filled the air. Elias helped her down from the wagon and led her inside. The cabin's single room was plain, rough-hewn. Walls, a stone hearth, a sturdy table and chairs. It was not elegant, but it was warm. And more than that, it felt alive, like a place built by hands that cared for it. Elias set her bag by the hearth. "It isn't much," he said, his voice low, "but it's mine. And if you'll have it, it can be yours too." Clara's breath caught. No man had ever spoken to her like that, not as if he were weighing her against his pride, but as if he had already decided she belonged. She looked into his gray eyes and felt, for the first time, that she was not being measured, but welcomed. Life in the timber camp was nothing like the quiet rhythm of Clara's hometown. From the moment she woke each morning, the air rang with the clang of axes, the groan of falling trees, and the shouts of men hauling logs through mud and snow. The scent of pine sap clung to everything. Her skirts, her hair, even her hands seemed steeped in it. At first, Clara felt like an intruder. The lumberjacks, hardened men with calloused palms and booming laughter, stared openly when Elias introduced her. Some exchanged knowing smirks as if to say, "Let's see how long she lasts." A few muttered under their breath, skeptical that a fine-bred lady from the plains could endure such a rough existence. Clara caught the words, but she held her head high. She had faced worse than whispers before. Still, the work tested her in ways she had not imagined. Fetching water from the icy stream left her fingers numb. Splitting kindling blistered her palms until they stung with every movement. Cooking over a smoky hearth for a dozen hungry men demanded speed and precision she hadn't yet mastered. More than once, she burned bread or undercooked stew, and the men groaned in mock despair. Clara flushed with embarrassment, but Elias's steady glance kept her grounded. He never laughed at her mistakes. Instead, he quietly showed her how to mend them, how to bank the fire just right, how to swing the axe with her whole body instead of only her arms. One bitter morning, when snow crusted the ground, Elias handed her a saw nearly as tall as she was. "Think you can help me with this?" he asked, nodding toward a pine waiting to be felled. The men chuckled from a distance, certain she would refuse. But Clara set her jaw and took her place opposite him. Together they dragged the saw back and forth, its teeth biting deep into the wood. Her muscles burned, her breath came hard, but Elias matched her rhythm, his gaze steady and encouraging. At last, with a groan, the great tree toppled, crashing into the snow. Clara staggered back, her chest heaving, her arms trembling, but her eyes shone. "Not bad," Elias said with the hint of a smile, brushing sawdust from his coat. The men stopped laughing after that. Days bled into weeks, and slowly Clara found her place. She rose with the sun, worked alongside Elias, and shared in the grit of the camp. Her hands grew rough, her back sore, but her spirit was stronger than ever. When she burned bread, she tried again until it came out golden. When her palms blistered, she wrapped them and swung the axe anyway. Each failure was met not with despair, but with stubborn resolve. Winter pressed hard upon the timber camp. Snow lay thick against the cabin walls, and the forest groaned under its weight. Days were short, nights long, and the men worked tirelessly to cut enough wood before the trails froze solid. Clara rose, each morning before dawn, stoking the fire and preparing meals while Elias and the others hauled timber. She had grown used to the rhythm, her muscles stronger now, her spirit more rooted in this rough life than she ever thought possible. Yet one evening, as the men trudged back from the woods, something was wrong. Elias walked stiffly, his jaw tight. His sleeve darkened with blood. Clara rushed to him, her heart lurching. "What happened?" she demanded, reaching for his arm. "Tree shifted when it fell," one of the men answered grimly. "Crushed him against a stump. He wouldn't stop until the job was done." Clara's hands shook as she guided Elias inside the cabin. He tried to wave her off, muttering, "It's nothing," but when she peeled away the fabric, her breath caught. His arm was gashed deep, the skin torn raw. Without hesitation, Clara fetched clean cloth, hot water, and the herbs she had learned to use from her mother. She pressed the wound firmly, ignoring Elias's hiss of pain. "You'll sit still if you know what's good for you," she scolded, her voice fierce. The men hovered awkwardly at the door, unused to such tenderness in their rough world. Elias, usually so steady and silent, met Clara's eyes and gave a faint smile through the pain. "You're a commanding one," he murmured. "And you're a stubborn fool," she shot back, though her hands were gentle as she bound the wound. That night, she sat by his side, refusing to sleep. She spooned broth to his lips, changed his bandages, and kept the fire burning. Elias watched her through half-lidded eyes, his voice low. 10 men were blind, Clara. Blind as stumps. You were never too tall. You were just too much woman for the small ones. The words sank deep into her heart. She blinked back tears, brushing damp hair from his forehead. "And you, Elias Carter," she whispered, "are the first man strong enough to see me." In the days that followed, Clara's care nursed Elias back to health. She chopped wood in his place, cooked for the men, and kept the camp running. The lumberjacks who had once doubted her now looked at her with something close to awe. She had proven herself not only strong enough for their world, but strong enough to hold it together when it faltered. When Elias regained his strength, he found her one evening outside, standing tall beneath the pines. The snow glittered in her hair like silver threads, and the cold air painted her cheeks with color. He stepped beside her, silent for a moment before speaking. "I asked for a partner," he said quietly. "Didn't know I'd be given more than I deserved." Clara turned to him, her heart swelling. "And I asked only for a chance. Didn't know I'd be given a home." The distance between them closed in an instant. Elias's rough hand found hers, warm and solid, and for the first time in her life, Clara felt truly seen. Not as something to be endured, but as something to be cherished. There, beneath the towering pines and the starlit sky, their bond was sealed. The wilderness had tested them, and in the struggle, it had forged something unbreakable, love rooted as deeply as the forest itself. Spring came late to the Montana woods, but when it arrived, the thaw was like a hymn sung by the earth itself. Snow melted into rushing streams, buds broke open on the pines, and birdsong returned to the frosted silence. For Clara, it felt as though her own spirit was awakening with the land. By then, Elias's arm had healed, leaving only a scar that he wore like a badge. He and Clara had fallen into an easy rhythm, working side by side through the days and sharing quiet conversations by the fire at night. What began as partnership had deepened into something steady and sure, something Clara had once feared she would never know. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in gold and violet, Elias took her hand and led her outside. The forest was hushed, save for the distant cry of an owl. He stopped beneath a towering pine, the tree so tall it seemed to touch the heavens. "Clara," he began, his voice low but steady. "I've never been a man for fancy words. I don't have riches nor fine things to offer, but I have these woods, this cabin, and my heart, and all of it is yours, if you'll be my wife." Clara's breath caught, tears welling in her eyes. For a moment, memories of all the rejections pressed in. The 10 men who had turned her away, who had called her too tall, too much, not what they pictured. And now here stood Elias, a man carved by hardship and wilderness, offering her not excuses, not pity, but his life. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking with joy. 1,000 times? Yes? They were married a month later in the clearing near the camp. The preacher who had first carried Clara's name westward performed the ceremony, his voice ringing steady against the forest air. The lumberjacks gathered, in their cleanest shirts, standing as witnesses with respectful grins. Clara wore a simple gown her mother had sent, white against the green of the pines. When Elias slipped the plain gold band onto her finger, Clara felt the weight of it settle not as a burden but as a promise. Solid, lasting, true. The men cheered. Hats tossed into the air, and Elias kissed her beneath the open sky. Life did not grow easier after that, but it grew richer. Clara threw herself into her new role with both strength and grace. She helped Elias fell trees, kept the household running, and welcomed weary lumberjacks to their table. Where once she had been whispered about as too tall, she was now admired as a woman strong enough to match the wilderness and the man she loved. Seasons turned, and the cabin expanded. Elias built her a porch where she could sit in the evenings, watching the sun sink behind the pines. Together they planted a small garden, coaxing beans and potatoes from the stubborn earth. In time, the laughter of children filled the cabin, their voices rising with the crackle of the fire and the call of the wind through the trees. Clara often thought back to the girl she had once been, the one who sat in her room weeping, convinced that love was beyond her reach. She wished she could take that girl by the hand and whisper, "Hold on. Your story isn't over. You were made tall not to be diminished, but to stand where others cannot. And one day, a man will see you, truly see you, and find you perfect." As she stood on her porch one golden evening, Elias's arm wrapped around her waist and the forest stretching endless before them, Clara knew she had found everything she had ever longed for: a home, a partner, a love that did not ask her to shrink, but invited her to stand tall. And so the woman rejected 10 times for being too tall at last discovered the truth. She had never been too much. She had simply been waiting for the one man strong enough to be just right.